Hi students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is internment, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. In our last lesson, I told you that while FDR is one of the most popular presidents in history, there are two things he did that are widely criticized. One of those was the court packing plan, which you learned about in the previous video. And the other was the internment of Japanese Americans, which we will look at today. Before we get to internment, let's learn a little bit of background to World War II. Get ready to fill in the missing words on your vocab sheet. So World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. And that led many countries in Europe, like France and England, to declare war on Germany. However, the US decided to remain neutral. Neutrality means not taking sides. Between 1939 and 1941, Hitler took over most of Europe. As you can see in this map, all of the areas in yellow were conquered by Germany. The only parts of Europe that didn't get taken over were England, which is over here on the left, and the Soviet Union on the right. Because England is an island separate from mainland Europe, Hitler was able to concentrate most of his soldiers on the border with Russia. That's over here. And for the first few years of World War II, that is where most of the fighting in Europe took place. We'll come back to that in a later video. So, as Hitler was conquering most of Europe, the US remained neutral and decided to stay out of the war. But that changed on November 7th, 1941, when the Japanese launched a surprise bombing attack on a US naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. You might remember from our unit on imperialism that the US took over Hawaii in the 1880s, and they also took over a lot of islands in the Pacific Ocean that they wanted to use as naval bases. And Pearl Harbor was one of those naval bases. As the Japanese grew more powerful at the beginning of the 1900s, they started to compete with the US for dominance over those islands in the Pacific. And it was this competition that led the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. Here's a picture from the attack. Japanese planes flew over Pearl Harbor and dropped bombs on US ships stationed there. They destroyed 20 US warships and killed 2,335 Americans. In response, the US declared war on Japan, and the US was now involved in World War II. On a side note, you learned that although the New Deal helped bring down unemployment in America, it was really the beginning of World War II that ended the Great Depression. So it was around 1941 that the US economy finally started to recover. Okay, now let's talk about internment. You may recall from our lesson on Schenck v. US, which happened during World War I, that during times of war, the government often violates citizens' civil liberties. Civil liberties are basic rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. Civil liberties are often violated during wartime because the government decides that winning the war is more important than protecting people's rights. And this is exactly what happened again during World War II. In 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which is more commonly known as internment. This executive order required all American citizens of Japanese descent to register with the government, leave their homes, and relocate to prison camps. By the end of World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans had been interned or imprisoned in those camps. So why did the government do this? The rationale was Japanese Americans were disloyal to America and could not be trusted. The government feared that they would plot secret attacks against the US or act as spies and pass secrets to the Japanese government. What was life like in the internment camps? As you can see in the map on the left, most of the camps were on the west coast because that is where most Japanese Americans lived. And the camps were located in rural areas, usually in the desert. Prisoners lived in large dormitory-like buildings, like the ones shown in this picture. I don't want you to confuse internment camps in America with the concentration camps built by the Nazis, which I'm sure you learned about in global history. In Nazi concentration camps, inmates were forced to do labor, and they were murdered in large numbers. That was not true in American internment camps. Within the internment camps in America, families had freedom of movement. They could walk around, socialize, and play. But they could not leave the camps. As you can see in these pictures, the camps were surrounded by barbed wire. So in that sense, being in the camps was like being in prison. Internment was a clear violation of civil liberties, in particular of the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process to people accused of crimes. In other words, a right to a fair trial before being put in prison. But the Japanese Americans who were interned were not given that right. These were US citizens who had committed no crime. I'll say that one more time. These were US citizens who were imprisoned only because of the fact that their ancestors were Japanese, which made them suspicious in the eyes of the US government. These people were forced to move to prison-like camps without ever being charged with a crime or ever being given a trial. In 1944, a Japanese-American man named Fred Korematsu refused to leave his home and move to the internment camps. Korematsu sued the government, arguing that internment violated his Fifth Amendment rights. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court upheld the law. That means the court declared the law legal, and Korematsu lost. He was forced to relocate to an internment camp. No evidence has ever been found that any Japanese Americans were acting as spies or being disloyal to the US, and both Executive Order 9906 and the Supreme Court case of Korematsu v. US are seen as terrible violations of Americans' rights. They're just one more example of the government violating civil liberties during wartime. Although Franklin D. Roosevelt is remembered fondly by most Americans, his actions toward Americans of Japanese descent are a stain on his legacy. All right, now it's time to review the objectives. Look them over, and if there's anything you don't know, just rewind the video and look again. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.